The murmur of sympathetic clucking from my wife Amelia's assembled book club, a veritable flock of well-coiffed suburban hens, was almost deafening as I walked into our living room. Amelia herself, perched on the edge of the ottoman like a tragic heroine in a poorly staged community theater production, was dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a lace-trimmed handkerchief. And then, she was saying, her voice trembling with artfully feigned emotion, "He just left. No note, no explanation. Just abandoned me. After 22 years. Can you imagine? My name is Edward Stanton, 58 years old, and for the past 3 decades, I have been a senior archivist at the National Maritime Museum, a custodian of historical records, a man whose entire professional life revolves around the meticulous preservation of fact and the debunking of fabricated narratives. Amelia's current performance, I noted with a familiar weariness, was a particularly flamboyant example of the latter. I cleared my throat, a small, almost apologetic sound, yet it cut through their chorus of commiseration like a foghorn. 6 pairs of eyes, wide with a mixture of surprise and disapproval at my untimely interruption of their grief counseling session, swiveled towards me. Amelia's head snapped up, her expression of tragic abandonment momentarily faltering, replaced by a flicker of something else. Annoyance? Guilt? Or perhaps just the irritation of an actress whose scene has been unexpectedly upstaged. "Edward!" she exclaimed, her voice a little too bright, a little too brittle. We weren't expecting you home so early." The symposium on 18th century naval cartography, did it finish ahead of schedule? The symposium, a 3-day event in a neighboring city, was indeed my official alibi. An alibi Amelia herself had encouraged me to accept, citing my need for a little professional stimulation and, more importantly, her need for some quiet time to herself to reflect. Her reflection, it seemed, had involved inviting her entire book club over for an afternoon of tea, sympathy, and the systematic assassination of my character. "The symposium was illuminating, my dear," I replied, my voice calm, my gaze sweeping over the assembled women, each one now sporting an expression of polite but clearly judgmental curiosity. But I found myself drawn back by a rather pressing need to clarify a few historical inaccuracies that seemed to have recently surfaced regarding my alleged abandonment of this household. I walked further into the room, my movements deliberate, my demeanor that of an archivist about to present a newly discovered and potentially rather controversial primary source document. "Ladies," I said, addressing the book club with a polite, almost professorial air, "I apologize for interrupting your literary discussion. But since the topic of my supposed desertion appears to be under such active consideration, perhaps you might be interested in a rather more contemporaneous account of recent events." I then reached into the inside pocket of my tweed jacket, the one I always wore to academic conferences, and withdrew not a scholarly paper, but my mobile phone. Amelia watched me, her eyes narrowing, a new, uneasy watchfulness replacing her earlier performance of wounded innocence. She knew me well enough to recognize this particular tone of voice, this quiet, almost preternatural calm I adopted when I was about to present an irrefutable and usually rather unwelcome piece of evidence. "You see," I continued, my thumb hovering over the play button on a saved voicemail message, "while I was indeed attending the aforementioned cartography symposium, a pursuit I assure you is far less conducive to marital abandonment than certain other extracurricular activities might be. My dear wife Amelia was apparently engaged in her own rather creative form of narrative construction." I then pressed play. The voice that filled the suddenly silent living room was not mine. It was Amelia's, recorded 2 days prior, during a call she had made to me at my hotel, a call she clearly and foolishly assumed I would not have saved. Her voice, then, had not been the trembling whisper of a heartbroken, abandoned spouse. It had been crisp, businesslike, almost cheerful. "Edward, darling," her recorded voice trilled. "Just a quick call. Hope the charts and maps are thrilling. Listen, about this weekend, I've decided to go ahead and expedite our little separation discussion. I've had the locks changed. Your things are in storage. Don't worry, I used that rather dreadful self-storage place you hate, The one out by the bypass, you'll feel right at home. My solicitor, Mr. Thorne, yes, that Mr. Thorne from the golf club, isn't he a poppet? We'll be in touch with your solicitor. Do you even have one, darling? Regarding the formalities. It's just better this way, Edward. Cleaner. No messy emotional scenes. You were always so averse to scenes. Consider this my final act of wifely consideration. Toodaloo. The recording ended. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the faint, indignant squawk of a blue tit outside the window, seemingly as appalled by Amelia's duplicity as her assembled book club now so clearly was. 6 faces, moments before alight with sympathetic indignation on Amelia's behalf, were now turned towards her, their expressions a comical medley of shock, dawning comprehension, and a certain horrified fascination. Amelia herself looked as though she had been struck by a rogue encyclopedia. Her face, which had been pale with feigned grief, was now flushed a deep, unbecoming crimson. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. The lace-trimmed handkerchief fluttered unheeded to the floor. The star of this particular melodrama had just been comprehensively upstaged by the irrefutable and rather inconvenient historical record. So, ladies, I said, my voice still calm, though not without a hint of dry, archival irony. As you can hear, the narrative of my abandonment appears to be a rather imaginative interpretation of events. A first draft, perhaps, in need of significant factual revision. The truth, as is so often the case with historical records, is a little more complex and considerably less flattering to the initial storyteller. I then looked directly at Amelia, my gaze unwavering. Amelia, my dear, I said, it seems your quiet time for reflection has been rather more proactive than you let on. Perhaps now, with your audience fully appraised of the source material, you'd care to offer a more accurate second edition of your tale. The archivist had just presented his findings, and the ensuing peer review, I suspected, was going to be brutal. The unraveling of Amelia's carefully constructed narrative of spousal abandonment was as swift as it was, from my somewhat detached archival perspective, deeply satisfying. Her book club, a collective entity I had privately nicknamed the Clucking Coven of Chipping Norton, reacted with a predictable, if somewhat delayed, cascade of horrified gasps and indignant murmurs, their sympathies rapidly and very audibly realigning. "Amelia, how could you?" exclaimed Mrs. Periwinkle, a woman whose own 3 divorces had apparently not inoculated her against the shock of a well-executed marital coup. "Change the locks? Mr. Thorne from the golf club? The bypass storage facility? That's simply monstrous." Mrs. Albright Smythe, the grande dame of the group, and a woman whose pronouncements usually carried the weight of papal decrees, fixed Amelia with a glare that could have frozen the Earl Grey in its delicate china cups. "Amelia Stanton, I am aghast. To deceive your friends, to slander your husband in such a manner, it is beyond the pale. Beyond the pale." Amelia, faced with the sudden, public evisceration of her carefully crafted victim persona, seemed to shrink, her earlier theatricality collapsing into a kind of sullen, petulant silence. She shot me a look of pure, unadulterated venom, a look that promised future, if currently unspecified, retribution. I merely met her gaze with a calm, almost regretful, shake of my head. This was not a victory I savored, not truly. It was a necessary corrective, a painful but essential realignment of a narrative that had strayed too far from the verifiable facts. My life with Amelia, a union of 22 years, had not always been a landscape of deceit and manipulation. There had been good years, early on, filled with shared laughter, intellectual companionship, and a genuine, if perhaps ultimately superficial, affection. We had met at Oxford, a postgraduate student in the arcane world of medieval manuscripts. She a vivacious undergraduate studying art history, drawn, she had claimed, to my quiet intensity and my fascinatingly obscure passions. I, in turn, had been captivated by her beauty, her quick wit, her seemingly effortless social grace, qualities so different from my own more introverted, academic nature. Our courtship had been a whirlwind, our marriage, in its initial years, a comfortable, if not wildly passionate companionship. We had built a life, a home, a shared history. We had even, after several years of trying, joyfully welcomed the birth of our son, Richard, a quiet, thoughtful boy who had inherited my love for history and his mother's artistic flair, and whose tragic, untimely death from leukemia at the age of 12, a decade ago, had been the unacknowledged fault line along which our marriage had slowly, inexorably begun to fracture. Richard's illness, his brave, heartbreaking battle, had changed us both. I had thrown myself into the meticulous, all-consuming demands of his care, finding a desperate solace in the quantifiable routines of medication schedules, temperature charts, blood count analyses, an archivist's attempt to impose order on an unbearably chaotic and cruel reality. Amelia, however, had seemed to retreat, to withdraw into a world of increasingly frantic social engagements, of expensive shopping sprees, of a desperate, almost manic pursuit of external distractions. She had loved Richard, I knew, in her own way. But his suffering, his slow, inevitable decline, had been a reality she could not or would not face. His death had shattered us both, but it had shattered us in different ways. I had found a quiet, grieving solace in my work, in the timeless embrace of history, in the knowledge that even the most painful narratives eventually become part of a larger, more coherent record. Amelia, however, had seemed to lose her moorings entirely. Her grief had curdled into a kind of restless, insatiable dissatisfaction. She became obsessed with recapturing her youth, with chasing fleeting pleasures, with surrounding herself with an ever-changing cast of superficial acquaintances who flattered her vanity and validated her increasingly extravagant lifestyle. Our shared life, once a source of quiet comfort, became a battleground of unspoken resentments and divergent paths. My attempts to reconnect, to find some common ground in our shared loss, were met with impatience, with dismissal, with accusations that I was wallowing in the past, that I was holding her back from living her life to the fullest. Her definition of fullest, it seemed, involved a great deal of expenditure and very little emotional intimacy. The final irrevocable rupture had begun about a year ago, with the arrival of Mr. Bartholomew Thorne, the aforementioned poppet from the golf club, into Amelia's orbit. Thorne, a recently divorced, aggressively charming, and, I suspected, financially precarious property developer with a penchant for younger women and older whiskeys, had clearly identified Amelia as a prime target for his particular brand of persuasive companionship. Her inheritance from her own mother, a modest but not insignificant sum, had, I later discovered, been systematically and rapidly depleted under Thorne's expert tutelage, invested in a series of guaranteed high-return ventures that had, predictably, yielded nothing but further debt and disillusionment for Amelia. My own carefully managed finances, my steady archivist salary, my small but secure investment portfolio, these had clearly become, in Amelia's and Thorne's eyes, the next logical target. My refusal to fund her increasingly grandiose lifestyle, my polite but firm rejection of Thorne's various can't-miss investment opportunities, had clearly precipitated this latest and most audacious plan to oust me from our shared home, to seize control of our joint assets, and to rewrite the narrative of our marriage, to cast me as the villain, the deserter, the one responsible for its demise. The voicemail message, her casual, almost cheerful announcement of my eviction and dispossession, had been the culmination of this strategy. She had clearly expected me to be away for the full 3 days of the symposium, to return to a fait accompli, a locked door, a fait accompli, and a letter from her solicitor outlining the terms of my surrender. My early return, my quiet presence in the living room, had been the unforeseen variable, the misfiled document that threatened to unravel her entire, carefully constructed deception. Now, faced with the undeniable evidence of her own recorded words, her carefully constructed victimhood lay in tatters at her feet, amidst the scattered remnants of her book club's sympathetic outrage. Mrs. Albright Smythe, her voice like chipped ice, was the first of the coven to pronounce judgment. "Amelia," she said, rising to her full, formidable height, "this is beyond reprehensible. To treat your husband, a man of clear learning and gentle disposition, in such a manner, and then to compound your cruelty with such blatant falsehoods, presented to your own friends. It is, frankly, unforgivable." The other members of the book club murmured their assent, their earlier sympathy for Amelia now replaced by a palpable, collective disapproval. They began to gather their things, their teacups left unfinished, their expressions a mixture of embarrassment and a certain righteous indignation. One by one, they offered me quiet, almost apologetic, nods as they filed out of the living room, leaving Amelia alone, a solitary, deflated figure amidst the wreckage of her ill-conceived tea party. When the last of them had departed, a heavy, uncomfortable silence descended. Amelia stared at the floor, her shoulders hunched, her earlier defiance completely extinguished. I waited. An archivist learns the value of patience, of allowing the silence to speak, to reveal the underlying truths that often lie hidden beneath layers of noise and distraction. Finally, she looked up, her eyes red-rimmed, her face a mask of bewildered despair. What do you want, Edward?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "What do you want me to do?" It was the first honest question she had asked me in a very long time, and it was the question upon which the entire future, or lack thereof, of our shared historical record now depended. The power dynamic had shifted. The custodian of facts had, at last, regained control of the narrative. "What I want, Amelia," I began, my voice quiet but firm, echoing in the suddenly cavernous silence of our living room, a room now stripped of its audience of sympathetic, if easily swayed, adjudicators, is for you to finally and comprehensively confront the truth of your own actions. Not the carefully curated, self-serving version you present to your book club, or to Mr. Thorne, or even, I suspect, to yourself, but the actual, unvarnished, and rather unpalatable truth. She flinched, her gaze dropping back to the expensive Persian rug, a rug we had chosen together on a sun-drenched afternoon in Istanbul, a lifetime ago, a silent testament to a happiness that now felt like a distant, almost mythical artifact. "For years, Amelia," I continued, my voice devoid of anger, more a weary recitation of long-archived facts, "our marriage has been a performance. A carefully staged production, primarily for your benefit, designed to maintain a certain social facade, a certain level of material comfort, that you seem to believe was your due, regardless of the emotional or financial cost to our actual partnership." I walked over to the mantelpiece, picking up a small, silver-framed photograph of Richard, our son, his smile so bright, so full of a life that had been cut tragically short. "When we lost Richard," I said, my voice catching almost imperceptibly, "we lost more than just our son. We lost each other, or perhaps, more accurately, the illusion of what we had believed ourselves to be." I retreated into my grief, into my work, into the quiet order of the past, because the present had become unbearable. You chose a different path. A path of distraction, of acquisition, of attempting to fill the void within you with things, with experiences, with the fleeting admiration of superficial acquaintances. Amelia was crying now, silent, shoulder-shaking sobs that seemed to rack her small frame. But I continued, not out of cruelty, but out of a desperate, long-suppressed need for her to finally, truly hear me. "Your involvement with Bartholomew Thorne," I went on, "was not, as you might try to claim, a momentary lapse in judgment, a desperate search for companionship. It was a calculated business decision, Amelia, a merger and acquisition. You saw him as a means to an end, a way to maintain the lifestyle you had become accustomed to, a lifestyle our shared resources could no longer comfortably sustain, especially after your rather enthusiastic liquidation of your own inheritance on his various can't-miss ventures. Her head snapped up at that, her eyes flashing with a spark of her old, defensive anger. That's not fair, Edward. Bartholomew. He understood my vision, my potential. You never did. You were always so cautious, so content with your dusty old books and your predictable little life. My predictable little life, Amelia, I retorted, my voice hardening slightly, was the life that provided the stability, the security, the foundation upon which you built your increasingly elaborate and entirely unsustainable castles in the air. A foundation you were quite prepared to dynamite, it seems, in order to abscond with whatever perceived valuables you could salvage from the wreckage. I gestured towards my phone, still resting on the coffee table, the damning voicemail a silent, potent witness. Changing the locks, putting my possessions in a storage facility I despise, instructing your solicitor to initiate divorce proceedings based on a fabricated narrative of my abandonment. These are not the actions of a grieving, confused spouse, Amelia. These are the premeditated, calculated actions of someone engaged in a hostile takeover. A takeover of our shared home, our joint assets, and indeed, my very identity as your husband. She stared at me, her face a battleground of conflicting emotions. Anger, shame, a dawning, terrified comprehension of the precipice upon which she now stood. So, she whispered, her voice hoarse, what now, Edward? Are you going to divorce me? To ruin me? Ruin you, Amelia? I echoed, a humorless smile touching my lips. My dear, you seem to be doing a remarkably efficient job of that all on your own. Mr. Thorne's guaranteed high-return ventures, as I recall from the rather alarming credit card statements you so carelessly left on the hall table last month, appear to be yielding rather significantly negative returns. And your reputation, after today's little performance with your book club, is likely to require some rather extensive archival restoration. I paused, letting my words sink in. As for divorce, I continued, yes, Amelia. That is, I believe, the only logical and indeed long overdue conclusion to this particular historical narrative. But it will be a divorce on my terms. Not yours. Not Mr. Thorne's. There will be no further attempts to fabricate narratives, to conceal assets, to engage in emotional or financial blackmail. There will be a full, transparent, and equitable division of our legitimate marital property, based on verifiable facts and legal precedent, not on your aspirational lifestyle requirements or Mr. Thorne's predatory calculations. I walked back towards her, stopping a few feet away. What I want from you, Amelia, I said, my voice dropping to a quieter, more intense register, is an end to the lies, an end to the manipulation, an end to this corrosive charade you have been playing for far too long. I want you to instruct Mr. Thorne immediately to cease all current legal actions against me. I want you to agree to a fair and honest accounting of all our assets, both joint and individual. And I want you to prepare yourself for a future where your financial well-being is entirely and solely your own responsibility. Her eyes, when they met mine, were filled not with defiance, but with a kind of dazed, bewildered surrender. The fight had gone out of her. The carefully constructed edifice of her self-deception, built over years of denial and entitlement, had finally, comprehensively, collapsed under the weight of irrefutable, recorded truth. And if I don't, she whispered, a last, faint flicker of her old, manipulative self. I simply looked at her, my expression unyielding. Then, Amelia, I said, my voice like chipped ice, I will instruct my own solicitor, a man far more formidable and far more expensive than your Mr. Thorne, to initiate proceedings that will not only secure my interests, but will also, I assure you, subject your and Mr. Thorne's rather creative financial dealings to a level of forensic scrutiny that I suspect neither of you would find particularly comfortable. The threat, though veiled in polite, archival language, was unmistakable, and she knew, with a certainty that seemed to drain the last vestiges of color from her face, that was a threat I was fully prepared and eminently capable of carrying out. The archivist had presented his ultimatum. The next entry in this historical record would be hers to write. But the parameters, The verifiable facts were now, at last, firmly under my control. The week that followed Amelia's dramatic unmasking before her horrified book club was a period of intense, if largely behind-the-scenes, activity. True to her word, or perhaps, more accurately, true to her dawning understanding of the catastrophic legal and financial precipice upon which she now teetered, Amelia instructed her solicitor, the unfortunate Mr. Bartholomew Thorne, to stand down. Alastair Finch, my own formidable legal counsel, received a rather terse, almost panicked, communication from Thorne, suggesting an urgent, off-the-record discussion to explore avenues for an amicable and expedited resolution to all outstanding marital matters. Amicable and expedited, Alastair had remarked to me over the phone, a note of dry amusement in his voice. A rather significant shift in tone from their earlier pronouncements of untenable abandonment and non-negotiable spousal entitlement. It seems the prospect of a forensic audit of their joint financial activities, particularly Mr. Thorne's rather enthusiastic advisory role, has had a remarkably clarifying effect on their legal strategy. We agreed to the meeting, of course, but on our terms, in Alastair's office, with a clear agenda focused on full financial disclosure and a swift, equitable division of legitimate marital assets. There would be no further discussion of my supposed desertion, no more attempts to paint Amelia as the wrong party. The voicemail message, a copy of which Alastair now possessed, had rendered that particular narrative permanently and irrevocably defunct. The meeting, when it occurred, was a study in contrasts. Amelia, pale and subdued, barely spoke, deferring almost entirely to Thorne, who, stripped of his usual bluster, adopted an air of chastened, almost obsequious cooperation. He presented a preliminary schedule of assets, which Alastair and I reviewed with the meticulous, dispassionate scrutiny of seasoned archivists examining a potentially forged document. There were, as expected, discrepancies. Attempts to undervalue certain joint investments, to overstate shared debts, to conveniently omit certain, less tangible assets Amelia had acquired during her more extravagant spending sprees. But these were minor skirmishes, easily identified and rectified by Alastair's sharp eye and my own intimate knowledge of our financial history. The real battle, the one over the house and the bulk of our savings, had already been won, not in this sterile conference room, but in my living room, with the playing of that single, devastating voicemail. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. We were no longer negotiating from a position of emotional vulnerability on my part, or assumed entitlement on hers. We were engaged in a straightforward, if regrettable, business transaction, the dissolution of a failed partnership, with the terms dictated by verifiable fact and legal precedent. The process took several more weeks, a tedious but necessary untangling of 2 decades of shared life. There were moments of frustration, of course. Amelia, egged on by Thorne, who clearly still harbored some resentment over his public humiliation, would occasionally attempt a last-ditch effort to claw back some perceived advantage, to reintroduce some element of emotional blackmail. But Alastair, with his unwavering calm and his encyclopedic knowledge of family law, shut down each attempt with ruthless efficiency. "Ms. Ashton," he would say, his voice like silk draped over steel, "your client's emotional distress, while regrettable, does not alter the fundamental legal and financial realities of this situation. Shall we return to the verifiable data, Mr. Thorne?" And Thorne, invariably, would retreat, his arguments deflating like a punctured soufflé. In the end, the settlement was fair, perhaps even from a purely dispassionate perspective, a little generous on my part. I had no desire to leave Amelia destitute, despite her actions. My primary objective had been to protect my own financial security, to ensure my future was not encumbered by her recklessness or Thorne's predatory ambitions, and to extricate myself from a toxic, emotionally draining marriage with my dignity and my assets largely intact. The house, our beautiful Victorian townhouse, was sold. The proceeds were divided according to a formula Alastair and Thorne had hammered out, a formula that took into account my significant premarital contributions and Amelia's rather enthusiastic depletion of joint funds during her Thorne-inspired spending era. She received a sum sufficient to secure a modest apartment and a degree of short-term financial stability, but a far cry from the lavish lifestyle she had clearly envisioned for her newly single and supposedly generously endowed self. My own share, combined with my existing personal investments, which, thanks to my father's foresight and my own prudent management, were substantial and entirely separate, ensured my own comfortable, if not extravagant, future. The collection of 18th-century naval charts, my true passion, remained, of course, unequivocally mine, their historical and intellectual value far exceeding any monetary figure Amelia or Thorne could have ever comprehended. Bartholomew Thorne, I later heard, quietly faded from Amelia's life once the financial well had run definitively dry. His particular brand of charm and investment advice apparently required a constant infusion of fresh capital to maintain its allure. Amelia, stripped of her benefactor and her illusions of effortless affluence, was left to confront the rather more prosaic realities of rebuilding her life on her own terms. As for me, the archivist, the quiet custodian of historical truths, I found a certain grim satisfaction in the final, meticulously documented closure of this particular, painful chapter. The narrative had been corrected, the forged entries expunged. The true record, based on verifiable fact and irrefutable evidence, now stood as the definitive account. The locks on my new, smaller, but infinitely more peaceful apartment were secure. My personal effects were no longer in a despised storage facility by the bypass, but arranged with care in a space that felt truly my own. And the silence in my home was no longer the silence of abandonment, but the quiet, contented hum of a life reclaimed, a future rewritten, an archive finally and definitively in order. The voicemail message, that small, digital artifact of Amelia's hubris, remains saved on my phone, a permanent, if rarely consulted, entry in the historical record, a reminder that even the most carefully constructed deceptions can be undone by a single, unforeseen, and irrefutably authentic piece of evidence. The truth, as any good archivist knows, has a remarkable and ultimately unyielding persistence. The years that followed the dissolution of my marriage to Amelia were a period of quiet, almost monastic dedication to my work at the National Maritime Museum. The dust of that particular domestic upheaval settled, leaving behind a landscape that was, if not entirely unscarred, then at least significantly more structurally sound. My research into 18th-century naval cartography flourished, unencumbered by the emotional and financial drain of Amelia's increasingly erratic ambitions. I published several well-received papers, curated a successful exhibition on the early mapping of the Pacific, and even, to my own quiet surprise, found myself a sought-after speaker at international historical conferences. It seemed that the predictable little life Amelia had so derided was, in fact, capable of yielding its own, rather significant dividends, albeit of an intellectual rather than a purely material nature. I heard little of Amelia directly. Our paths, once so uncomfortably intertwined, now diverged completely. Occasionally, a mutual acquaintance from our old social circle, a circle I had largely, and with considerable relief, withdrawn from, would offer a piece of unsolicited and usually rather depressing news. Amelia, it seemed, had struggled to adapt to her new, more modest circumstances. Her attempts to launch herself as a lifestyle consultant or an antiques appraiser, fields in which her actual expertise was, to put it mildly, negligible, had foundered. She had, according to these reports, moved several times, each apartment smaller, each neighborhood less fashionable than the last. There were whispers of mounting debts, of a reliance on the reluctant and increasingly strained generosity of her remaining friends. Bartholomew Thorne, her erstwhile solicitor and Svengali, had long since vanished from the scene, presumably in search of fresh, more solvent pigeons to pluck. There was a certain tragic inevitability to her decline, A predictable trajectory for someone whose entire sense of self had been built on such flimsy foundations of entitlement and superficiality. I felt not vindication, not anymore, but a kind of weary sadness for the waste of a life, for the potential that had been squandered in the pursuit of such empty, ephemeral goals. My own life, by contrast, found a new, unexpected richness. Freed from the constant, low-grade anxiety of Amelia's discontents, I rediscovered old passions, cultivated new friendships based on shared intellectual interests rather than social expediency, and even, to my astonishment, found a quiet, comfortable companionship with a woman named Dr. Eleanor Ainsworth, a visiting scholar in maritime history from a Canadian university. Eleanor, the irony of her name was not lost on me, was intelligent, kind, and possessed a wonderfully dry sense of humor. She found my fascinatingly obscure passions genuinely fascinating, and my quiet intensity a source of calm strength rather than boring predictability. Our relationship developed slowly, cautiously, built on a foundation of mutual respect and a shared love for the stories hidden within old documents and forgotten artifacts. It was a world away from the shallow glitter of my life with Amelia, and infinitely more rewarding. One crisp autumn afternoon, about 5 years after the divorce, I received an unexpected package in the mail. It was from Amelia. Inside, there was no letter, no explanation. Just a small, rather battered, antique silver locket, one that had belonged to my own grandmother, a piece Amelia had always particularly admired and had, during the division of our assets, rather aggressively insisted on keeping, claiming it held deep sentimental value for her, a sentiment I had, at the time, privately doubted. Now, here it was, returned without comment. I wasn't sure what to make of the gesture. Was it an act of contrition? A desperate attempt to re-establish some form of contact? Or simply a final, symbolic relinquishing of a past she could no longer afford to maintain, either financially or emotionally? I never found out. I placed the locket in a drawer with other family heirlooms, a small, tarnished artifact from a closed chapter of my historical record. It held no power over me anymore, no emotional charge. It was simply an object, a piece of history. The true treasures, I had learned, were not those made of silver or gold, but those forged in shared experience, in mutual respect, in the quiet, enduring bonds of genuine affection and intellectual companionship. My life with Eleanor, Ainsworth, not Stanton, flourished. We traveled together, co-authored a book on early exploration routes, and found a deep, abiding joy in simply sharing our days, our thoughts, our discoveries. The archive of my life, once so dominated by the chaotic, poorly catalogued entries of my marriage to Amelia, was now being filled with new, richer, and infinitely more satisfying narratives. The voicemail message, the one that had so dramatically upended Amelia's carefully constructed deception, remained saved on an old, rarely used, phone in the back of my desk drawer. I hadn't listened to it in years. I no longer needed to. Its purpose had been served. The historical record had been corrected. The truth, in all its stark, unassailable clarity, had prevailed. And I, Edward Stanton, the quiet archivist, the man once deemed abandoned, had moved on into a future where the only narratives that mattered were those built on foundations of honesty, integrity, and a love for the enduring, verifiable, and deeply satisfying truth. The final audit on that particular chapter of my life was well and truly closed, and the balance sheet, I was pleased to note, showed a significant and entirely positive net gain in peace of mind. The ensuing years brought a quiet unfolding, a gentle settling of the dust from past upheavals. My work at the National Maritime Museum continued to be a source of profound satisfaction, culminating in my appointment as chief curator of manuscripts and rare books, a role that felt like the natural culmination of a lifetime dedicated to the preservation of historical narratives. Eleanor Ainsworth and I built a life together that was rich in intellectual companionship, shared laughter, and a deep, quiet understanding that needed few words. We never married, finding our commitment to each other in the daily rhythms of shared research, leisurely travels to dusty archives in forgotten corners of Europe, and comfortable evenings spent reading by the fire in our cozy, book-filled home. It was a partnership of minds and hearts, unburdened by societal expectations or legal formalities, and it was, for both of us, more than enough. Amelia's life, from the infrequent and increasingly distant reports that still occasionally filtered through, continued its slow, downward trajectory. The small silver locket she had returned was, it seemed, one of the last vestiges of her former, more affluent existence. There were rumors of further financial difficulties, of strained relationships, of a growing isolation. It was a sad, predictable denouement for a life built on such superficial foundations. I felt no triumph in her decline, only a lingering, faint echo of the sorrow I had once felt for the bright, vivacious young woman she might have been, before ambition and entitlement had so comprehensively corrupted her spirit. Bartholomew Thorne, her erstwhile solicitor and Svengali, effectively vanished from the legal landscape. Alastair Finch, my own astute counsel, had once drily remarked that Thorne's particular brand of aggressive client advocacy had likely found less fertile ground once his reputation for, shall we say, creative interpretation of fact became more widely known. Some historical records, it seemed, are best left undisturbed, a lesson Thorne had learned to his considerable professional cost. The most rewarding aspect of my later years, however, was my relationship with Richard, our son, had he lived. That void, that profound, unfillable absence had been a constant, quiet ache throughout the tumultuous years with Amelia and in the peaceful ones that followed. But in my work, in my mentoring of young scholars, in the establishment of a small educational trust funded by a portion of my own carefully managed inheritance, a trust dedicated to supporting underprivileged students with a passion for history and archival research, I found a way to honor his memory, to transform that enduring grief into a quiet, positive force. It was my way of ensuring that his bright, curious spirit, his love for learning, would, in some small measure, continue to illuminate the world. One crisp autumn afternoon, many years after Amelia's book club had so unceremoniously disbanded in my living room, I was giving a lecture at a local university on the importance of primary source verification in historical research. I spoke of the dangers of fabricated narratives, of the archivist's duty to preserve truth, to challenge falsehoods, to ensure the integrity of the historical record. As I concluded, a young woman in the audience raised her hand. "Mr. Stanton," she asked, her voice clear and intelligent, "in your experience, what is the most powerful tool an archivist possesses in uncovering a hidden truth or correcting a deliberately falsified account?" I paused, considering her question. My mind flickered back to that long-ago afternoon, to a lace-trimmed handkerchief, a voicemail message, and the sudden, stark exposure of a carefully constructed lie. "Sometimes, young lady," I replied, a faint, reflective smile touching my lips, "the most powerful tool is not a complex algorithm or a newly discovered document. Sometimes, it is simply the unexpected, irrefutable, and clearly recorded sound of the subject's own voice, speaking their own unvarnished and entirely self-incriminating truth." For an archivist, or indeed, for anyone seeking clarity in a world often clouded by deception, there is no substitute for a well-preserved, accurately dated, and strategically deployed primary source recording. The young woman nodded thoughtfully, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. The rest of the audience, I suspect, merely thought I was referring to some obscure 18th-century naval dispatch. But I knew, with a quiet certainty that needed no further annotation, that the truest, most enduring archives are not always those found in dusty vaults or leather-bound volumes. Sometimes, they reside in the quiet, unshakable integrity of a life lived honestly, and in the courage to confront and correct the narratives that seek to distort or diminish that truth. My own historical record, after all, was now a testament to that very principle. And it was an archive I was content to curate, with meticulous care for whatever time remained. The final years of my tenure as chief curator at the National Maritime Museum were dedicated to a project that felt like a culmination of my life's work: the creation of a comprehensive digital archive of previously inaccessible naval records, making centuries of maritime history available to scholars and enthusiasts around the world. It was a complex, demanding undertaking, requiring meticulous attention to detail, cutting-edge technology, and a deep understanding of the fragile nature of historical documents. It was, in essence, my professional magnum opus. Eleanor Ainsworth, my beloved partner, collaborated with me on aspects of the project, her expertise in historical context and her keen eye for narrative detail proving invaluable. Our life together remained a quiet haven of intellectual companionship and mutual respect, a testament to the enduring power of a bond forged in shared passions rather than societal expectations. We never felt the need to formalize our union. Our commitment to each other was a living, breathing thing, requiring no external validation. Amelia, my ex-wife, faded further into the background of my life, a distant, almost forgotten figure. The occasional, third-hand reports suggested a life of quiet obscurity, a stark contrast to the glittering, attention-seeking existence she had once so desperately craved. Bartholomew Thorne, her former solicitor, effectively disappeared from the legal profession, his career a casualty of his own hubris and unethical practices. The echoes of their ill-conceived campaign against me had long since dissipated, leaving behind only a faint, cautionary tale in the annals of my personal history. One afternoon, while meticulously cataloging a newly acquired collection of Nelson's letters, my assistant, a bright young archivist named Thomas, a name that always brought a faint, ironic smile to my lips, brought me an unexpected visitor. It was Ms. Albright, the rather formidable woman who had presided over the disastrous family mediation session so many years ago, the one where Cassandra's lies about Leo's paternity had been so dramatically exposed. Ms. Albright was now retired, her demeanor considerably softened, her eyes holding a new, more reflective wisdom. She explained that she was volunteering with a local historical society and had heard of my work at the Maritime Museum. She had come, she said, not just to see the archives, but to offer a belated and entirely unsolicited apology. "Mr. Stanton," she began, her voice hesitant, "I have often, over the years, reflected on that unfortunate mediation session. At the time, I confess, I was perhaps too easily swayed by your ex-wife's rather theatrical distress. I did not fully appreciate the calculated nature of her assertions, nor the quiet strength of your own position." She paused, then continued, "Your subsequent actions, the presentation of that, rather definitive DNA evidence, it was a masterclass in strategic patience and irrefutable fact. It taught me a valuable lesson, one I carried with me throughout the remainder of my career. Always, always verify the primary source, especially when emotions run high." I was taken aback by her candor. "Ms. Albright," I said, "I appreciate you saying that. It was a difficult time." "Indeed," she replied, "but you handled it with a dignity and precision that was, in retrospect, quite remarkable. You were an archivist defending his most precious record, were you not?" Her insight was surprisingly astute. I simply nodded. After she left, I sat for a long time in the quiet solitude of my office, surrounded by the silent, patient testimony of centuries past. Ms. Albright's unexpected visit had been like finding a forgotten addendum to a long-closed file, a small, clarifying note that brought a final, unexpected measure of closure. My life, like the archives I so lovingly curated, had been a journey of sifting through layers of information, of identifying the authentic from the fabricated, of preserving the true narrative against the corrosive forces of time and deception. The voicemail message that had so dramatically altered the course of my divorce from Amelia, that small, digital artifact of her own undoing, was still stored away somewhere, a relic of a past battle. But its power, its significance, had long since been superseded by the quiet, enduring strength of a life rebuilt on foundations of honesty, integrity, and a profound, abiding love for the unvarnished truth. The final accounting, not just of my marriage, but of my life's work, was one I could look upon with a quiet, archival satisfaction. The records were complete. The narratives were accurate. And the legacy, I hoped, was one of meticulous care, unwavering integrity, and the enduring power of a well-preserved fact. That, for an archivist, was the most satisfying denouement of all.